Thank you for coming. I wanted to just kind of find out a little bit about who's in the room. So are you all professionals? Or if you're a professional Jew, raise your hand. Or if you're like a lay leader or a volunteer, and it can also be the same people because I know that there's overlap in those ways. Okay, great. So you have my bio, so I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but suffice it to say that I live in different worlds at the same time. And this is something that is very much the prevalent mode of engagement for people of a certain age range. And it's not necessarily always about age range, obviously, that we'll return to that again and again. That social media is not just the way to attract younger people, which is a polarity that's set up by a lot of people erroneously. But I work at the Federation in Los Angeles, which is like the UJIA here. I work as a consultant with the ROI community, which is a group of Jewish innovators in their 20s and 30s from around the world. And I work with a number of other Jewish organizations, mostly nonprofits and NGOs, working in the States. It's not necessarily tied to the city that I'm living in because the global web makes everything possible no matter where you're living. So the challenge to all of us as Jewish leaders in whatever projects we are leading is about creating the relationships that get people to commit to our endeavors and our efforts. So my perspective on this is that it's all about creating relationships, and really it always has been. The reason that people connect to a cause is because they connect to the story, or because they connect to the person who told them the story of the project. So I think it's about conversing, it's about commenting, it's about being engaged and helping to create those meaningful relationships. So. And I wanted to say also that just throughout, there'll be like a number of slides that are kind of graphics heavy, and then there's going to be a number of slides that are going to be a little bit more text heavy. So hopefully, if you're a visual learner, you can see it this way, and if you're more about the verbiage, then we'll have that for you too. So leadership looks different for everybody. Sometimes there's a challenge to find leaders to step up. My sense of the Jewish community worldwide is that there are often too many leaders, which is something that I am not prepared to address today. But in some ways, what we have to deal with is the opposite of this cartoon. It's not saying, oh, what do we do about it? Oh, what should we do about it? I don't know what should we do about it. It's like, I want to do this. I want to do that. I want to do the other thing. And the I is, in some ways, for me, not necessarily what leadership needs to be now. Sometimes leadership is very visible. You can tell somebody is a leader. Sometimes it's actually a little bit harder to tell, and sometimes you'll find out that somebody who you didn't know was the leader is actually the leader. And I think that kind of murkiness is actually becoming a lot more prevalent because the way people are leading organizations and initiatives is changing, and it's incorporating more things from the web generally, and certainly from what is being called now. I understand my friends in Silicon Valley are now calling it the social web. It used to be called social media, then before that it was social networking, but they've been referring to it as the social web. And I think that there's a lot of focus on social media and using social media, but I think that eventually will recede as a point of emphasis and really be folded in to general communication strategies and the way people connect. So people who bill themselves as social media consultants or whatever will talk about social integration, or we'll talk about media, a complete media package, a multi-platform media package. I think that the language is on its way to changing again. I don't know if any of you have ever used these little word clouds, but I have another one coming up later. But this is a way to illustrate the kinds of qualities that you're looking for in a leader. This is from a site called thelivingleader.com, which I never knew about before I did an image search for it. But in all of leadership situations that I've been a part of, ideally a leader has all of these things, but practically I've noticed that not a lot of them do. So I think that this is an aspirational thing. I'd love to see all Jewish nonprofit leaders affix this to their refrigerators or something. They could look at it every day and say, have I been an honest communicator today? Have I been principled about my passion today? But the reality is that the people don't always get there. So this might seem a little bit visually overwhelming, but let me explain to you what this is. This is from a site called wordle.net. And by the way, I wanted to just interrupt myself to tell you that this presentation will be available to you as a link afterwards. So if you missed something during the presentation, everything that is up there you will have. So that's something you can take away with you. So what I did is I put the description of tonight's event that was handed out to you on the flyers with the biographies of the presenters and everything into the site called wordle.net. And what came back was this. And what it's showing you is that the larger words appear more frequently than the smaller words. So what I've learned about this is that Debbie and Jeff and I have certainly talked about ourselves enough in our bios that the words have repeated enough and they're slightly larger. I'm sure you're all thrilled to see the word Jewish, as the biggest word in this little diagram. We've also got community and leadership and leading and leadership with a lowercase and leadership with an uppercase. And so the idea is that you can actually get a good representation about a visual representation of what an organization or a project is about by running just the text of that content through wordle.net. So I always like to pass along this tool. It often helps people to show visually what they're about. And you can actually, I didn't actually modify this one, but you can modify it by removing certain words. So if you wanted to remove Esther, Jeff, and Debbie, and or if you wanted to remove the word therefore, which may not necessarily help you with anything, you could do that, and you could tweak this in order to show visually what you're about. So I wanted to also prepare you that I speak in a lot of buzzwords. I think part of this has to do with the fact that the field in general of social media and building relationship through social media, if a field it be, is populated by certain buzzwords and concepts that I'll use throughout. So I just wanted to prepare you for them. So this idea of showing up, of being present. Visibility is very important for leadership. Creating and deepening relationship, obviously key. I'll say the word relationship probably about 100 times if you'd like to keep track. I think my record is maybe 50 or 60 in a session of this size. But make sure that everything that you do adds value. There's so much content out there. I don't know how many email newsletters you get a day. I've ceased to count because there's no point. And what's going to get me to read a newsletter is a very short list these days. But if I know that an organization consistently adds value with the content that they're sending me, then I'm much more likely to open that email. And of course that leads to more involvement and donations and all of that kind of stuff. To be passionate and authentic is one of the most important things that you can do in the social web. People see and sense when you're not being authentic, when you're putting on a voice that's not your own, when you're trying to portray the project that you're part of as something other than it is. Some people are very stupid, but most people are very, very smart about sniffing out authenticity and inauthenticity. So be passionate about it. The idea behind leadership these days is also about collecting and parsing the content that's given to you by other people and really enabling those people's voices to be heard. And not taking necessarily credit for it on your own, just to know what your people want and to be able to represent it by honoring their contributions and not absorbing them as your own. And when I use the your, I don't mean any particular people in this room because obviously you're all wonderful leaders who honor the contributions of others. The last two things on this list are things I actually stole from the U.S. Federation system in that they started sending out emails from JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, which is the overarching umbrella organization of all the federations in the States, the U.S. and Canada. And so they have these two phrases that they started appending to the ends of their emails: live generously and make life more meaningful. And I really like those as kind of just motivators in life. Like if you try to treat every interaction as a way to be generous with what you have to share it with other people and to help make their lives more meaningful, I think that that's really a great basis to start from. Okay. You're lucky that we don't have internet, because now I don't have to show you the videos that may stress you out but aren't meant to. But as I said, you'll have access to these in the presentation. These are all hyperlinked, so all you have to do is click and they'll play. There's a great thing called Social Media Revolution, which is, again, it's a little bit overwhelming and overstimulating visually and in an auditory sense. I wanted to just give you that warning, but it shows you how the world is changing and what kinds of interactions are happening on a daily basis, and on, in 5 years what the world is going to be like and that kind of thing. What happens on the internet in 60 seconds is pretty self-explanatory, and it's a short video. The Social Media Revolution one is much longer. And where do good ideas come from, which is a great, it's a book trailer, and I don't know how many of you have promoted or seen a book trailer, but nowadays people who are coming out with books also have to come out with some sort of video component to promote it. So this is actually I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's a style of explanation where somebody has a whiteboard and a dry erase marker, and they draw like a giant explanation of the words, and it's really worth seeing. It's about this guy's book, but it's really about where good ideas come from and the process for incubating those ideas. So I pass those on to you. You will see them at your leisure, or not at all, but they're available on the internet. So today, I just wanted to give you those buzzwords from before as concepts to keep in mind. We're also going to look at some social media tools specifically. We've got some Twitter case studies. We've got some tips and best practices, and I definitely will be allotting time at the end for questions. So either you won't have questions and you'll just talk and get out early. Or you can feel free to ask as many questions as you want. So I just wanted to check in, see how's everybody doing. Everyone's still awake despite the dim lights? Yes? You can see everything's much better now? Okay, groovy. All right, so nonprofits are seeing immense results on Facebook. Over 80% of organizations surveyed feel that Facebook is effective in increasing awareness and doing their outreach and really providing information, but all of that is toward enhancing relationships. So I can tell you that in terms of the way, and you probably know this as well, in terms of the way journalism used to work, right? So not journalism, PR. So PR used to be like, you had an event, you were coming out with an event, you came out with a press release, you sent it out to the press, right? There's a little bit more nuance to it than the way I just presented it. Like, there are relationships that are developed, but there isn't the same kind of bidirectional flow of information. And now Facebook allows sharing from people who aren't necessarily being sent the information that's just appearing in their world, and so they're forwarding that on. They're starting conversations around the content, which you may not have provoked as the person who originates the content. So this is actually a really great time for nonprofits. And social media is certainly important for Jewish organizations. This is on probably another slide later, but I have to say that the biggest, the analogy that I've used to talk about what Facebook is when I talk to Jewish audiences is to talk about it as Jewish geography done better. Because the reality is, you used to have to sit next to somebody and talk to them and ask them like a million questions about themselves before you found out that they were remotely related to you, or that they knew your best friend from growing up, from summer camp, or from the movement, or whatever the story is. And now you can see all that information, and it enables connection at a much deeper level much earlier. Again, some people would suggest that maybe that's not a good thing, but I happen to think it's an amazing thing. It also creates an important bridge between in-person moments. One of the things that I'm asked constantly is whether I am afraid that online interaction is going to replace offline interaction, and I don't think it will. I think that they are two different things. I think that the online interaction is an essential part of creating bonds before and after an in-person experience. So I think that it's an amazing tool that we have at our disposal now. And also, this concept of the younger people, which I've talked about before, that it's not about age. It's about people who are in a certain stage of understanding of what the tools are available and how committed they are to building relationships and expressing the story of their organization through those relationships and those tools. So there are a lot of people who are skeptics or believers. Also, I have a lot of pop culture references. This is Agent Scully and Mulder from the X-Files. And Agent Scully was always the skeptic, and Agent Mulder was the believer. And they had many adventures together, and it was amazing until the series was not amazing anymore. But that's a little sidebar. But I think that, in my mind, I think that there are a lot of people who embody parts of both of them. Not just in all areas of life, but certainly as it applies to social media. And I like this picture because they're looking at a computer. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity around social media and connecting online. And then there's also a lot of fear. There's also a lot of fear of loss of privacy, fear that people are going to get misconstrued, that there's a risk taken without necessarily any kind of promise of reward. I want to honor both of those perspectives because we probably all know people who overshare on Facebook or who under and overshare at the same time. Which I'll tell you just one anecdote is that I've seen a lot of my friends who occasionally do something that has been termed vague booking. And vague booking is when you put something on Facebook that's just vague enough that it gets people concerned about you. So it'd be like, sigh, not again, ellipsis, and then you have, oh, sweetie, what's wrong? Are you okay? Is everybody okay? And then there's a string of comments that does that. But what were they expecting to happen is really the question. It's like the cry for help on a smaller scale, and that's something that I wouldn't encourage organizations or leaders to do because obviously there's a little bit of a stature thing to consider when you are a leader of an organization. You can't be vague booking. That's the one thing you're going to take away from tonight is no vague booking. But I also have a number of connections for what's Jewish about social media besides Jewish geography, which I skipped to before. But the idea that there are these communal values, and I know this is a lot to look at once. I couldn't work the transitions on PowerPoint. Also, I think it's important that you know that I'm not an expert in all things technological, so I'm willing to admit that, and there may be questions that you may have that I won't know, or I'll have to say I'll look them up later. But I think that kind of humility is important to know that the answers may come from another place. So I think the "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha," that you should love your neighbor as yourself, Kol Yisrael erevim zeh lezeh, that all of us are responsible for each other, Al tifrosh min hatzibur, that you shouldn't separate yourself from the community, and now everybody can be a rabbi or a writer or an activist. There's this concept that we are an Am Kadosh, Am Kohanim, a nation of priests. And the reality is that we all have pulpits now because we can, whether it's just our Facebook feed or our Twitter feed or something like that, or a blog is obviously a very strong example of that as well. And in terms of educational values, the way we feel as Jews about education, about social justice, about the things that move us in our lives, all of those things are, that you should at betachlo, which is a quote from the Haggadah, that about explaining things to people. Aseh lecha rav, create for yourself a rabbi or a teacher. And this quote from Ta'anit 7a, where it says, "Much have I learned from my masters, and more from my colleagues than from my masters, and from my disciples the most." And we get to access all three of those groups online nowadays. We can reach out to the masters, we can reach out to our colleagues, and we can learn from the people who learn from us. And it's an amazing time to do that. And the social aspect of besides Jewish geography is that there's a stereotype, at least in the United States, and you'll correct me if this is not correct here, is that Jews sometimes don't have boundaries, and we might like to get involved in other people's business that may not be our business. But we're doing it from a really good place that we really want to know. And this is really an opportunity. Social media provides you a window into essentially seeing what your children are doing when they don't call, which is what my father has started to use the internet for, I believe, because he looks on Facebook to see where I am and where I've been, and And it's actually great that I don't have to tell him every single one of those things, so that when I talk to him, we can go on a deeper level. He can say, oh, I saw you were at Camden Coffee House. What was that like? And I can tell him the tales of Camden Coffee House. There are not so many tales, by the way, but that's another thing. So leadership, almost in the beginning, Moses himself was unavailable for this photo, so I had to go with Mel Brooks as Moses. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with this scene from History of the World Part 1, but basically it's Moses, he gets the 10 Commandments, he's really annoyed because God is talking to him, and then he takes the 15 Commandments at that point, he takes the 3 tablets in his hands, and he goes to the people and he's like, I now give you these 15, and one of them slips and falls on the ground and shatters, and he goes, 10 Commandments! So the idea is that Moses, the Mel Brooks Moses, was being very improvisational in that moment. He, instead of trying to put those back together, he's like, all right, well, here's what we have, and we're going to move forward with what we have. Side note is that my dad actually runs a blog called JewishHumorCentral.com. You can feel free to access that. He does daily posts about Jewish humor, and so he had rented this movie and paused it to see what the missing commandments were. And they are in Hebrew, and they are phrased in the "thou shalt not" formula that is from the other 2 as well. But I don't remember all of them. But one of them is like you shouldn't laugh or something like that. So that one fell to the floor. Or you shouldn't make fun of things, and that one fell to the floor. So I think and that attention to detail is really interesting to me. All right, that's another sidebar. There's a lot of pop culture in this. I hope that's okay. So there are a number. When I give sessions on social media, I often talk about the difference between leadership, the way old media used to work, and the way new media works. And I think that the stand-up comedy style is very it's very much like a person versus an audience. It's actually kind of like this now, but not like we will be later. Is that you're looking toward one person to give you the answers. And some people are comfortable with that, but it does create a little bit of an adversarial atmosphere, especially in comedy. And then there's the leadership style where it's more team building. It's more about people working together, that there's not does everybody know that this is, whose line is it anyway? Okay. And one of the guys is named Ryan Stiles, so I just was playing on that for leadership styles. This guy with the smushed up face in the middle. Yeah, the tall guy. I've always really responded in comedy to people building something together rather than one person. You can build, when there's a team working on something, not everybody relates to every single person on the team, but there's usually somebody you can find who's a good touch point for you. There's obviously such a thing as leading by committee, which we all know just often does not work. But I think about in terms of building a leadership style, for me, it's more about taking the voices that appear in the village and kind of like synthesizing them. And this is also, whose line is it anyway? In their village, apparently there's only 2 women, I think. But anyway, you see all the different personalities that are involved, and this is one of the challenges that we face when we're dealing with being leaders of organizations, is that everybody has a different side of themselves that they're showing to you at various points during the day, and it's about the leaders. It's the leader's job to synthesize all of these, to try to create a vision that's not the leader's own vision, but is the group vision, but to express it in a way that's relatable and communicatable, catching and all that. Of course, not all ideas that come from the people are good. We've got Yitro, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, who suggested to him that he might want to stop answering everybody's questions individually and maybe farm that out to a posse of judges. So that was a really good idea. Tzlofchad, who died, leaving his daughters and no sons. So that challenged the rules of inheritance. And then there were 2.5 tribes that decided they weren't going to cross over into the land of Israel. They wanted to stay on the other side of the Jordan. And that was fine too. Then there are the ones that are not such great ideas, like Aaron's sons brought a strange fire in incense and then were consumed by it. Korach famously led a rebellion that ended in all of the rebels being swallowed up by the earth. So I think God made an executive decision in terms of those two outcomes. We don't have those kinds of things at our disposal, so I would urge you all to consider the ideas that come from the people, even if you don't adopt all of them. And I really like this quote from Seth Godin, who's a very well-known writer. He's written a lot about management styles. And he said that there's no risk, then there's no art. He talks a lot about art and how it's important to create art and to create atmospheres where people feel comfortable creating art. And if there's no art, there's no reward. So it's one of those things that I like to keep in mind during my creative moments. So the idea of how ideas come to life and how everything runs these days, from commerce to ideas that are the culture of ideas through journalism and writing. That it used to be it was an elevator. It was just coming down from the top floor where the executives lived to the bottom floor where the mailroom was, and that's how messages got distributed. It was very democratic, and the opportunity for user impact was really low. You couldn't make an impact from the mailroom. So now there's also the idea of bottom up, is that people don't actually, there's some things that people don't actually create until they know that there's a demand for them. So if any of you have seen the crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter or Indiegogo, or there's one now based out of Los Angeles called Juicer, where people can give small amounts of money to fund things into being. And some of those things already exist. They might be films, but most of them are in progress. And sometimes people want to know that there's not going to be an audience for something, so they get the buy-in ahead of time, which is really a fascinating way to do things. And also the fact is that while companies used to do a lot of kind of promotion where they would shove out content to everybody, the reality is now that people are also relying on the peer reviews of that product. I know that when I do a search for something that I'm looking to buy, whether it's like a hard drive or something like that, or even something smaller, bicycle, air pump, whatever the story is, I do the research online, and I don't look at the product review, the product description. I look at the product reviews from users to find out what people are really saying about it. And that's just the way people operate now. So it's important that in terms of the messaging coming out of organizations, that it's not just about the consistency of the message coming out, but it's where that message lands and how those organizations deal with integrating suggestions and feedback from the users. And so I think that the next phase, from the top down to the bottom up. But now I think we're dealing with something, I don't think anybody's used this phrase before, but the Wonkavator from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which didn't just go up and down, but it went sideways and crossways and allways, and sometimes it went up and out through the roof of the factory and out of the building. And so I think that if, just as an image, that really resonates with me. I don't know exactly how you get the elevator back once it's gone out of the building. But they seem to be okay with it in the movie. But and I really wish that I had actually had a screen cap from the original film, because I happen to like that one better than the Johnny Depp version. Again, that's a sidebar. But the idea that it could go to any room that you never knew existed in the entire factory, and then if you went to all the rooms, you could also go up and out. And that, as a metaphor, just really resonates for me in the way I like to think about leadership and idea generation. I was part of a conference call a couple of weeks ago. Through the Jewish Communal Service Association in the States. And they had Misha Galperin, who's the head of the Jewish Agency, and Larry Moses, who runs the Wexner program in the States, the Wexner Leadership Program, and they did a conference call about Jewish leadership. And so I listened to it on the phone, and I was tweeting about it on Twitter, and I also heard them say something in the session that I thought was really interesting. They said that the future cannot be crowdsourced. So naturally, I decided to crowdsource an answer to that question. And so I did. So what you see there is a screen cap of my Facebook feed where where I asked that question, and then you see 15 people liked it, and then there was a number of comments that followed, and it was a really long comment thread where we talked about what crowdsourcing is, what vision is, what leadership is, whether we have the kind of vision and leadership, leaders with vision that we need in the community these days, whether what the role of the crowd is in determining the vision and in terms of messaging. And it was a fascinating thing. And I wrote about it for the Jewish Philanthropy, which I don't know if anybody reads the Jewish Philanthropy. Okay, so it's worth. They have a lot of content on there. It's kind of hard to skim through all of it, but I feel like there's always something interesting there. So I basically crowdsourced a response to this, thereby proving that in some ways the future can be crowdsourced. But people were even while they were part of the crowdsourcing, people were saying that it couldn't be crowdsourced. So there was like this layer of meta awareness that was really interesting. Did you have a question?
Did Larry Moses or Nisha Galbraith respond to your article or to the crowdsourcing?
They haven't responded in a public way. I did get a note from Larry saying that he really appreciated the discussion and was looking forward to future conversations. So. And I think part of the interesting thing is that neither one of them is really active in the social media space in a major way, and that's something that I want to encourage people to become more active, especially leaders. There's a certain kind of a cachet or a feeling that you get when the leader of an organization responds to you. And I'm glad you asked that question, because we're going over the next thing, which is world leaders on Twitter. And I think part of the interesting thing is that neither one of them is really active in the social media space in a major way, and that's something that I want to encourage people to become more active, especially leaders. There's a certain kind of a cachet or a feeling that you get when the leader of an organization responds to you. And I'm glad you asked that question, because we're going over the next thing, which is world leaders on Twitter. There was a poll about which world leaders are most active on Twitter. And these are 3 direct quotes from this survey that the penetration on Twitter for world leaders will be nearing 100%. And this would render Twitter as a de facto communication tool for all heads of state, which is fascinating, because as of even 6 months ago, people were saying, why should I be on Twitter? I don't care what anyone had for lunch. And that's not what's going on Twitter. Sure, there are people who tweet pictures of their lunch. That is true. And if you like that, feel free to use it for that. But there's so much more that it can do as an official communications channel. And I think it's a real. I wouldn't say necessarily that all of these world leaders, who I obviously know intimately, are necessarily personally inclined toward using Twitter to communicate. But I think that they have teams who are saying it's important for you to be visible, it's important for you to be there. So does anybody want to guess what the, yeah?
No, I was just going to ask another question. The only problem I've got with that is that it appears that a lot of those world leaders are not tweeting themselves. Yeah. So one of the things that I have around authenticity there, in actual fact, I was in a room where there was a major speaker doing a presentation, and they were encouraging you to tweet. So I was really enjoying the presentation, so I tweeted, and I got a response from the person who was standing there obviously doing the presentation. So I was like, how does that happen? But it was a personal response from them.
Right.
So thank you, Larry, it was a great tweet, thank you very much, I hope you're enjoying the presentation, and with their name on the end. And I kind of went, that's not them.
Right.
They don't even know that's being written about them. Yeah. So they're saying the right things,
right.
But I have a problem with the authenticity around some of that.
Right. I think that's right on. I mean, if you look at the people, we've got the top 10 here. Sorry, UK. But basically, I think we have to assume that Barack Obama is not looking at his Twitter account. And I think we also have to assume that we don't want Barack Obama to spend his whole time on Twitter, right? So I think that in certain cases, yeah, just a second, in certain kinds of cases, obviously, there has to be an awareness and a forgiveness of that. But if somebody tweets at you as Barack Obama and is like, thanks for tuning into my speech that you're sitting across from me right now, like, that's not right. But usually, fortunately or unfortunately, the organizations that we are leaders and involved in leadership for don't have these kind of numbers. So there are opportunities in which you can have, UJI office or UJI, whatever you can have something that's clearly that's not a person, but that is acting like a person and being engaging and sharing content as it comes up. Yeah.
That's kind of irrelevant now. But there are people who do it really well, who do it personally, and there are people who do it really badly. And it's probably a terrible example because they're not really leaders, but pop stars tend to do it quite well, but then it can become over personal and it can be bad PR. And I think the issue with some of these people as well is that they've got to manage it from a PR perspective too. If you think about people who've done it really badly, not necessarily on Twitter, but people like David Cameron and his, I can't remember what his subject is, he had the YouTube thing for the elections. And it was just a little bit too close to home, being in his kitchen and hearing him saying things like chillax. It just, it's not necessarily credible in the right sort of way. So I think, things do have to be really heavily managed. But that was probably very bad management when the person standing right in front of you doesn't have it. There's something blatantly not even the audience who responding.
Right, you're great because you just fed right into my next slide. Is that world leaders are using social media like celebrities. And I just didn't type that now, so that was very, very nice of you to create that segue for us. Is that they're treating it like a regular broadcast media channel, which is fine, but it provides for minimal talkback, or as I like to say, one direction. Okay, I gotta laugh. That's important. And that these are about having fans, and not necessarily about partners or investors or supporters. Supporters actually, is probably a synonym for fan when we're talking about political leadership or whatever, because I think most people understand that when they get a letter from Barack Obama thanking them for contributing to the campaign, it's not really from Barack Obama. So, I think that there is a degree of understanding there about that. But the fact is that 21st century community leaders can and should and are using it like humans and saying, it's about forming relationships. You don't always necessarily have to respond to every tweet. But, the fact that when you see something that you connect to and say thank you and please and I appreciate, your support, and that kind of thing can really help deepen the commitment. And it creates more of a bi-directional connect. Or as I like to say, because I needed another music metaphor, was to foster the people, which may not be as big here as One Direction, but it is a band. With 4 squares, apparently. They have 5 versus 4. All right, it's not a perfect metaphor, but the idea is that it's about cultivating those connections to people and understanding that they are investors and shareholders in the work that you're doing. So in terms of effective social media interactions, again, it's a relationship, it's collaboration, it's involvement in the pulse of what's going on in the public. It's about both initiating and participating in conversations that already exist. So I think the blogging world was a really good example of this until blogs kind of got consumed by general media culture and now are parts of websites. But when blogs were independent, and now I sound like back in the old days, but where the blogs were independent, they were really fresh voices and a real, really on the pulse of what the people were thinking. And what emerged was a real visible disconnect between leadership and the people that they were leading. And so I think it's important to keep your eye on that rift, which is sometimes navigable and sometimes just becomes so vast and like a chasm. But I think that, again, the authenticity, the adding value is so important. And value doesn't always have to mean the same thing. Something I talk about all the time is that value can sometimes mean information. So sometimes just an information push can give people the information they need. Sometimes it's about humor and showing that that you have a sense of humor about not just the product, but the general world that we live in. Humor is also one of those things that's difficult to navigate because sometimes people get offended. So again, it's having the commitment to customer service and feedback, so that if somebody is offended, you handle it, and if somebody is not offended and loves it, then you handle that too. It's not both of those people are your constituents, and they're both worthy of responses. And to just go through the things, and part of this is part of the value conversation, is the idea of having kavanah, of having a real intentionality between behind the messages that you're putting out in the world. Now, as I said before, I don't know everything about social media. This kind of thing that you're seeing now is increasingly prevalent on sites, and I see people shaking their heads at just how completely overwhelming this can be. I can tell you I only know about 7 or 8 of these icons, and I think that that's okay. There's always going to be more tools popping up than anybody can possibly know everything about. So I think, again, that's part of the humility of knowing that this world is growing much faster than any of us can possibly keep up with, but that certain of the icons that you see that you recognize, does anybody not recognize any? Does everybody here recognize at least one of the icons here? Yeah, okay, great. So, I mean, if nothing else, you can recognize the one that says YouTube on it. So that's really helpful. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity. I could just sit down and make it my business to learn all of these symbols and what they are. But the reality is that the ones that are used most frequently are going to rise to the top in terms of visibility. So just know that even I get confused about social media sometimes, and usually once during every presentation, somebody asks me a question about a tool that I don't use at all, or sometimes that I've never heard of. And it's okay to say you don't know. You'll hear that from me later on, probably more than once. But there's lots going on out there, and this shouldn't really overwhelm you. It should make you excited, because it means that there are a lot of people who are figuring out how to connect to information in new and different ways. Visually, on an audio perspective, literarily, journalistically, there's a lot going on. And some of these people might see the tools as intimidating. I don't know if The Far Side as a cartoon series was as popular here as it was in the States, but I love this cow tools picture, because when it was published, the author had to explain to all the people who wrote to him what cow tools were and what the cow could possibly be using these tools for. And he hadn't really given it much thought. He just kind of drew it as if there was a farmer standing by his tool bench, but instead of a farmer, it was a cow. And then what happened, and this would have happened in a different way if social media had been around, is that he got inundated with letters to the editor of the paper where it was published saying, what are cow tools? Or some people were like, I think that's just a saw. And some people said, that's just a trowel or a pitchfork. And why would a cow need a pitchfork? And people started getting all micro and Talmudic, really, about what these tools were and what they could possibly be used for by a cow. And I think so in some ways, I think it's better not to get hung up on what the tools that you don't recognize and what they're used for might not be the best use of time. But I think that a lot of the things like Twitter, Flickr, Skype, all of those things have sprung up in the last couple of years and are really developing in new and exciting ways. And sometimes that means that even the people who knew how to use them at the beginning don't know how to use them anymore because they've changed so much. So I think that it's valid to just know that there's a lot accessible out there, and in some ways this is also a very encouraging thing, because if you say to yourself, I've ever said this, I like Skype, but I wish there were a way for me to have multiple conversations with people, and wouldn't that be great if we could also share content around? And so Skype is developing that interaction space, and Google Plus is developing that opportunity for people. And the market is always expanding to answer these kinds of questions that you may be coming up with in your brain. So feel free to Google any question that you may be having in your brain, because there may already be a tool or an app for that. So in terms of how people become absorbed in social media, people often tell me, and I heard the question before when Debbie was speaking, is how do I find the time? This is such an overwhelming world, and there's so much information going on a regular basis, on a minute-by-minute basis. Is that how do you do it? And it's like any training system. So it's about trying to find the time where you have the time. Whether you're just decided you want to tone up your arms a little bit, so you started lifting water pitchers while you're in the kitchen, and you're just there's the little moments here and there that can add up. So I always recommend to people that if they're starting off on social media, that one of the things they might want to do is just take it as a coffee break, because you can sit there with a cup of coffee and you can read. It's like anytime you might want to read anything, you can just sit down and have that break and do that. There are numbers of ways that you can get involved in terms of how often you should be checking a feed. I would not recommend my way, which is to just have it on constantly and be completely riveted to it. But I think that there are certain organizations and people who I know are regularly putting content of value into the stream of information, and so those are the ones I'm more likely to follow closely. And also, each one of you, I am absolutely sure, has somebody in your network who is a media hub of sorts. They don't necessarily have to be a media professional, but you know that they've got a big network, that people listen to the work that they're doing, that there's a lot of comments or conversations on the posts that they put up. And those are the people you want to reach out to. Not in a, here, promote my initiative kind of way, because that's not the way people respond to those kinds of requests these days. It's about being respectful of what they've cultivated. It's about connecting to them personally through the points of their passion and through building a relationship and say, I represent this organization that I think you'd really enjoy, and let's have a conversation about it. Not, here's a list of all of our programs and you should go to our website and see if you want to connect to us. Because that's not the way to reach somebody. So that's one of the things that I recommend. Also, as we said before about Esther Kustanowitz, and I'll repeat it, I think, once more during the presentation, so maybe I should just add that to my list of buzzwords and buzz phrases. But I think it's important to ask questions, and ask people how they're using social media, because they might have an insight in that you don't have, that you wouldn't think to ask them about unless you just say, what's your social media strategy? So in terms of I think one of the ways I also refer to social media, of the absorption of messages and tools that are going on in social media, is to develop an ambient awareness. So this is kind of, in some ways, like learning a new language, where you might immerse yourself in an old pond to learn Hebrew, or you might just say, I have some Israeli friends, I'm just going to get together with them and make them speak to me in Hebrew, and I'm not going to speak any English. So those are different ways that you can apply the finding it, just feeling comfortable with the language, and some tools are terser than others, so you have to shorten your message accordingly or use certain words in order to express it. So I think that's another analogy you could use. Or if you're trying to find out about something, whether it's you're applying for a job at a new company, not that any of you are, but you would want to go to that website and find out about that company and see what they're up to and what kind of social media they're using and how they approach the collection and integration of ideas. And so that's really something called surveillance time that I like to say, is that you should see what they're up to. And you can, because now it's all public on the web. It used to be that if somebody had a media campaign, media strategy, it was kind of watermarked with a draft or internal only, do not circulate. But the reality is you can see what any organization is doing, because what their media plan is, because they're doing it in public and on the web. So it's totally okay to look at those organizations and say, they're doing this, I really like this, I want to incorporate this into my organizational media life. And it's also okay to say, ugh, that's a terrible looking website. I would never use that format in order to express my message. It's really okay to look to see who's doing it right and to figure out what you can borrow from them. So just in terms of boiling down the differences between Facebook and Twitter, we don't have time for me to take you through every aspect of the site on Facebook and on Twitter, and also because Facebook changes every day, and it will probably be done by the time it'll changed again by the end of our conversation. So there's really no point in my showing you screen caps of something that's already outdated in the next 10 minutes. But the idea of Facebook as a platform for sharing and discussion, in addition to distribution, is something that has been, in some ways, kind of taken over the reign of what began in the blogs, where people were having these intense conversations and comments. Now I see most of those people who started, especially in the Jewish blogging world, which is where I started, long story, I won't get into it now, but the idea that these conversations that people were having on blogs have kind of migrated over to Facebook. And because the crowds on Facebook tend to be a lot more intimate, either because they're friend circles or because they're people who have already committed to liking Jewish technology or some sort of micro subject, it's a lot more intimate in terms of a discussion, and it goes deeper. So Facebook, I like to say that it's something like a break room where you can be part of conversations that you're just walking into, and others that you can actually go into the break room and start a conversation. It also provides, again, the Jewish geography. You could say, oh, and this happens to me about once a week, where somebody will be commenting on something that I've posted on Facebook, and then another person will comment after them and say, hey, Esther, I didn't know you knew David Goldberg. How do you know him? And then David Goldberg will respond, oh, how do you know Judy Smith? How is that possible? And then everybody goes, small world, It's those kinds of conversations, and then those people who might have known each other when they were younger reconnect. So, and it's not to say that I'm uniting all the Jews. I would never say that. But the fact that that the wall, the Facebook wall, or now as it's called, the timeline, serves as a hosting venue for these conversations, also means that it's a little bit like a reunion, and it's really interesting to watch those conversations develop. And also people use it as like an invitation space. So that's why you guys use Evite here, but there's also there's some other paperless post that we have in the States that's also like electronic invitations to events. And people can see that their friends are coming, and because their friends are coming, they're more likely to come. So, or just that, even if they see they've been invited, that they can have a conversation. Are you going to go to that thing at DJ next week? Like, what's the story with that? And that's the socializing of all of these processes. And in Twitter, it's a lot about. I feel like the flow of Twitter is a lot more fast-paced than the flow of Facebook. And in some ways, it's because it's so streamlined, and each one of the tweets is 140 characters, and people are now shortening the URLs so that can have more characters to write about the links that they're sharing. And it's a little bit like a party that you might go to, with a lot of people milling about and having a lot of different conversations. And if you're near them at the time that they're talking about something, you might say, "Oh, hey, I have something to say about that," and you might be able to connect with them on that level. But it's really about, oh, did you see this? Did you see that? This is an interesting response to that, and it's a lot of kind of fast pitches. A baseball analogy, I don't know if that's going to work here, but or it's also like any place where there's a lot of people and a lot of conversations happening. Gesundheit. And it's also akin to me, for me, as to a CNN news ticker, like the one that goes on the bottom of the screen. It's always new, or you think it's going to be something new, so you better stay tuned to it, even though it'll be the same message, kind of said 3 times. What was really interesting to watch, and of course I'd rather have it had been not interesting by not existing, but during the recent bombings in Boston, as the manhunt continued for the people who had perpetrated the bombings, Twitter was on fire. It was unbelievable, like in terms of narrating what was going on in a way that you couldn't get on TV. And people were monitoring the police scanners and reporting things, and some of it was a mess because they were reporting things they should not have been reporting when things were just, they actually reported the names of 2 people as suspects who were not suspects. And so then people started again, it's a tool, and it's something that can sometimes get out of control, but it was really interesting to watch as basically you discovered how hard it is to hide in today's world. Because there's so much that's on camera and that's recorded, and there are people and eyes everywhere, and those eyes don't always see what they think they're seeing, but the amount of information that's coming in is a lot different. And there were a couple of people who got a little bit analytical about it and said, can you imagine what this would have been like to have this technology during 9/11? And I think about that all the time, about how much technology has changed since 9/11, 2001. Which I guess here is 11/9/2001, but you know what I'm talking about. So I think that there's definitely a lot of information coming, and it's not all accurate, and it's not all good, but if you stay tuned, you can usually see the best stuff rising to the top. So that's the difference between Facebook and Twitter in my mind. And I just wanted to address two tools that are actually being used quite a bit, but not by me. And so I wanted to just talk about them, just briefly. But you can skip to the last bullet where you can see that I say both are basically a mystery to me. I think that they're parts of Google Plus, including the Google Hangouts, which are the video chats, which are really interesting to me, but I have yet to find anybody in my circles who generally uses Google Plus more than they use Facebook or Skype or any combination of those things. And Pinterest, I mean, theoretically, it's a good space for all these things, for discussion and articles of interests. And I understand that there are certain segments of society, and that sounds weird to say, but I think there are segments, especially in the tech community, who are very big fans of Google+. But in terms of my life, it doesn't really affect me so much. And Pinterest is something that is basically like a poster board for images that is very popular among, I think the demographic is like women 30 to 45, most of them married, with kids who are in domestic situations, or who don't have a lot of time because they're balancing professional life and motherhood life and family life and all of those things, and people who are visually inclined. So I now have a lot of friends who are graphic designers and who are involved in visual media, and they love Pinterest. They can't get enough of it. I have a number of friends who use it as like a recipe book with photos of how things came out. I have friends who are using it to decorate their homes. When they find patterns they kind of clip it into this scrapbook situation. But I haven't found a use for it for me personally. It doesn't mean that I think it's not useful. It just means that it's not my thing. So that's, I'm happy to admit that they're both a mystery to me in terms of how they react to how I would interact with them. Yes?
It can be a great way to run a competition. Just thinking about it from an organisational perspective, or I work in advertising on the digital side, and I've seen quite a few examples of doing it, getting people to input pictures that describe something about them or the way they feel about a certain thing to actually encourage people to interact.
Or even if it doesn't appeal to you personally. But it's about finding those people for whom the images are the primary factor for engagement. So I think that's definitely something you want to consider and talk to your media people about. So what can I really like this Asel Harav thing. It's like on every slide. Basically, but I just explain a little bit more that it's about finding for yourself a teacher who can help you, but it's also about Rav in the sense of it's connected to Rabim and plural, and that there are many people who can help you, that it's not just about finding your guru, it's about finding a group of people who can be like an advisory board. I like that image a lot better than just having one Rav, because, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, so that means each Jew has 1.5 opinions, is that right? Yeah, so you need at least 1.5 rabbis as far as I'm concerned. So learn the language of Twitter, understand what a tweet is, or what a retweet is, what a direct message is. There's some basic things to learn, and then there's the deeper level of learning. So again, it's about learning the language, finding people who can help you learn the language. Also, I would consider social media is both an outreach strategy, like a PR mechanism, and an engagement provoker. So think about that as a kind of twin goals when you're trying to deal with social media as a tool. And in terms of a content plan, I've done a lot of presentations where I can talk for like an hour about creating a content plan and some advice for where you should find things to talk about. And some of that stuff will come, a little bit later in this presentation. But I think you should really be open to inspiration from wherever it comes. And that can be from the mainstream media, it can be from celebrity culture, it can be from politics and news, it can be from your local community. There are a lot of places where you can find inspiration, and especially in organizations that are largely involved in some way in social services and in reaching out to the members of our community in a significant way and creating opportunities to make life more meaningful. Certainly, inspiration is everywhere if you're looking for it. Oh, let's transition. Sometimes they're just hidden in the PowerPoint presentation, and I don't know why. But okay, so here's some actions for your organization, and this speaks to content also, is to determine your institutional voices and to figure out what makes you special in the community. Because everybody's like, we make Jewish lives more meaningful, or we make improving things in the social structure of London. great, but there are a lot of people who can generally say that's what they're doing. So the question is, what makes you unique? How does your group serve the community? And a tool for this that I like to use whenever I'm faced with a project that I don't fully understand is to create my own frequently asked questions list. Like, if I were looking at this from the outside of this project, what would my questions be? How is this project different from this other project that I know that has the same definition? What specific audience do you serve that somebody else doesn't serve? Why is there a need for this project in the community alongside all the other projects? Who's involved in it? Who sponsors it? Those are all questions that if you were being interrogated about your organization, you'd have to answer. So why not just answer them in advance? So you can't necessarily anticipate every question that anyone might ask you about your program or organization, but I find that I recommend this exercise to people all the time. It's like a little bit of an extrapolation of the mission statement writing exercise, but it forces you to think about things from an outside perspective because those are the people you want to bring in. So what questions will they have about your organization? And so everything, compelling content is one of these things that it's going to be very subjective. Your organization may not. I think there are certain things that are common. So, like for instance, compelling writing is usually a constant. Things that are written should be effectively written, not overwritten, not too jargony, not accessible. Like those kinds of things, I think, are common. But in terms of what your particular audience thinks is compelling, for some people it might be linking to a piece that Angelina Jolie wrote for the New York Times about her breast cancer decisions, but for other people that would not be the right choice because you don't want to necessarily dilute the content by invoking a celebrity. But for some people, a celebrity angle is actually a really good opportunity for discussion. And part of that's, the decision is going to be made by you and your organizations to know who your constituents are, which goes back to the previous advice about getting to know your constituents and having relationships with them. And having people to ask, say, is this a compelling idea that we should share? Is there a way to spin this in a way that's actually really meaningful and not just a way to capitalize on an issue that a celebrity has raised? And only you know the answers to that. I worked with a blog at some point which was always saying, whenever you can, include a celebrity angle because it's good for SEO, for search engine optimization, and for ranking. And because people, anybody who wrote about Angelina and her health decisions, like the week afterwards, got many more hits than they probably will get the rest of the year. And that has to be a consideration too. Like you might, if you have something really important to say, but it has to not be abused as something that you're like, oh, that's that organization that always tries to glom onto these celebrity stories, just to have a celebrity linked to it. Because again, that speaks to the authenticity angle. So it's about seeing things with open eyes and gaining inspiration from a lot of different places, but authentically and not in a way that, overemphasizes parts of culture that people may not be necessarily so thrilled with. I think also, also blogging I think is really important as part of a website because that gives you an opportunity to share on a regular basis what's going on in a central place because people will delete a newsletter. But if you have a central place where people can look to see what's going on, that's really a helpful thing as well as a great archive for you. And I think it's also a great place to host conversations. And when you go to other places and participate in other conversations, you leave a link back to your blog, and it also helps with search engine optimization and higher rankings. Yeah.
Are you saying something more than when you talk about hosting conversations? Are you talking about having comments, the comments being the conversation, or is it something more than that?
Yes and yes. So the opportunity, once you have a blog, the challenge a lot of people have is they're like, but how can I fill it with content? Like, it should be reliable that there's some steady content coming in. And one of the things that you can do is it's a great activation tool for engaging lay leaders and other project managers in helping them to have a visibility for the programs that they're involved with. So you could host a dialogue on a conversation. You could say, this is part of an ongoing series about Jewish leadership, and here is the schedule of people who are going to be commenting on it. One week will be Nikki Goldman, one week will be Sam Clifford, and then you'll have things to look forward to. It's almost like the virtual version of what we're doing here. And some of it is about kind of what they call it, frontal presentations, and some of it is about the interactive level of it. And I think the great thing about all this technology is you can really shape it the way you want to. And the way that makes sense that your organization or program can support, which is another issue. A lot of people say, I don't have time, I don't have staff, I don't have money. Those are the big three. There are probably more I don't have somewhere, but those are the ones I hear the most. And the idea that, if each person kind of like chips in a little bit, like you really only need one person who knows how to upload the content. But it doesn't mean that that person's voice is the only one that has to be featured. And in fact, it's a real opportunity to feature other voices other than just the executive director or the president. Why not hear from the people who are actively on the streets doing the work, or stories of impact? And those can be in text, they can be in image, they can be in video, and they probably should be in a combination of all three at various points. Not everyone has to have all three of those elements, but it's about engaging people from wherever they are in whatever way they feel most engaged. So some people are going to look at a picture and feel like it's worth the literal 1,000 words that the aphorism talks about. But some people are not going to relate. They're going to relate to a turn of phrase or a moving picture. So I think it's really about building the space for different voices and different modes of engagement. So asset mapping is something is a term that's used in a lot of different places, but I think that the way I like to use it is to try to identify who your assets are. It's essentially like, who do you have in your arsenal? Not to be all military, but who are your strongest resources? Who are the loudest voices in your media landscape? They could be the most influential people. They could be the people who have the largest Twitter following. They could be people who have no Twitter following but just have a really wide influence. And to try to invite their feedback and their partnership, because people want to be asked. Even though Debbie Klein said, don't wait to be asked. Yes, also that. But there are people who might not be comfortable with that. So to be a little bit proactive about it is really important. And you should consider inviting personal assessment by a social media trainer, but we'll get to that at another point. I've been told that we have 5 minutes, so I'm going to fly through some of the rest of these, but like I said, I will send the link to Nikki and Sam and have them distribute it to you. And this is really just a list of things that you can do, so you don't necessarily need me to explicate it at all. So there's also a blog strategy checkpoint if you wanted to. This is almost like the frequently asked questions exercise that you can use in your organization to talk about like what your blog would look like, even as an imaginary blog. Even if you don't create a blog, this is a good exercise to go through because it gives you an idea of where your stories are and who the voices are. How do I find things to post about? Again, this is something I can just flip through. I wanted to just show you this Twitter case study for the Jewish Outreach Institute based in New York. And so this is a screen cap of part of their Twitter feed, and I wanted to point out just a couple of things about it that I thought were really good. They've been actually pretty good in general about adopting these technologies early. They were one of the first organizations that had a blog that had regular content updated, not just with voices from their leadership, but from the voices from the community of the people they were impacting. So that was really great. The blog is not on here, but it's available at joi.org. So if you look at the tweets, you'll see that they have things called personal stories that are referred to with those hashtags, and so they know that they're letting their audience know that this is a personal story. And some of these links link back to content on their websites, and some of them don't. Some of them link to relevant content to their audience on other websites. And that's a really important part of this because it shows that they're really concerned with the constituents and the audience. And it's not necessarily always about promoting their own stuff. And they know that just providing something of value to the community that they're serving is a value and creates additional connections and understanding that they're not just self-promotional. They're really interested in how their constituents feel in terms of how they feel welcome in their community. So they are engaging their audience. Some of them are also, this idea of how do you refer to your partner of another background. It's engaging the audience. It's asking them questions. It's inviting their feedback. Excuse me. It's inviting their feedback. And also, you'll see that Kerry Olitsky, who is their executive director or president or founder, I'm not sure, he's the big guy over there. And so he's on Twitter also. And that's an important thing to have, especially with an organization like JOI, which is really about building connections and feeling inclusive. It's important to have his voice on there. I haven't really done a lot of research in terms of whether I think that he is tweeting on his own or if he's having other people tweet for him. It's probably a combination of both, and I think that that's okay. Anyway, so I also wanted to share with you 2 more tools, which I find are really good in terms of creating a visual representation of things that you may be doing. There's a tool called Storify, which basically creates a visual representation of any event that you've been to or anything that comes up on a certain topic. It's all drag and drop. You can do a search for whatever the term is. If you want to create something about how intermarriage is being seen in London, you would do like a search for intermarriage in London, and there would be like a whole bunch of things that would pop into the side, and you just drag them into the center and create a story. This is really great for conferences, especially if you have a hashtag, which I didn't explain and I should, is that when they have the pound or the hash sign in front of a term on Twitter, it's a way of organizing that information. Essentially, if you think about it as a filing cabinet with a tab on the top that says personal story, and then everything that's tagged with that would go in that folder. And if you clicked on personal story, you'd be able to find all that stuff. So again, you'll have a chance to look at this. This is an example of an event that a number of Jewish organizations, the Innovative Programs, did in New York a couple of weeks ago. And you can pull in photos, you can narrate it a little bit. What you'll see in the middle is that where it says keynote speaker, Merrick First, that was a little bit of the person who was curating the content, described a little bit about it and kind of created the connections between these documents. So Sarah and me who had tweeted about the event, and they pulled our voices in there as well. Similar is this new site called Tagboard that I found, which is this is for the ROI community, which is upcoming summit is in 2 weeks, and I'm going to Israel for that. But this is everything that is tagged with the hashtag ROICOM. And so you'll see one of the things that they're trying to do is create active engagement on Twitter. I should say we, because I'm part of this team. So you'll see my tweet in the center is that with my arrival in London, I'm unofficially on the road to ROICOM. Also, they're asking questions about like what their favorite ROI stories are, and somebody wrote being rejected twice. So that's unfortunate, but now it's up to us to reach out to him and say, we appreciate that you're with us online, even if you couldn't be with us, in person. It's a competitive process, and please, try again. In terms of ROI, we actually have people who have applied 3 times before they got in, so it happens. ROI is the community of Jewish innovators in their 20s and 30s that's run by Lynn Schusterman, and it's one of my consultancies. So again, I'm giving you lots of tools. We're really into the home stretch here. We should be finished right on time. There are a number of free webinars. I hope they're accessible from the UK. I actually don't know that for sure. But there are newsletters that you can sign up for. There's a series called In Plain English, which is a video series that shows you through very simple visuals how Facebook, Twitter, social media, image sharing, all of that stuff works. I didn't include them in the presentation, but that link will take you there. And I also wrote this piece a couple of years ago called Manifesto of Social Media for Jewish Organizations, which will tell you some of the things that I talked about here today and probably more. And these are 3 books that I just really enjoy and I recommend to everybody. Here Comes Everybody by Clay Shirky, which is subtitled The Power of Organizing Without Organizations, which tells you a little bit about the way the world works today in terms of how messaging is organized, how ideas come together, and what the new organization essentially looks like. Empowered Judaism by Ellie Confer, who's the founder of a community in New York called Hadar. And it's basically a community organized minyan, an egalitarian but halachic minyan. And so he talks about the different ways that people are interpreting Judaism and bringing it into their personal experience. And Linchpin by Seth Godin, Linchpin's subtitle is something about like how to make yourself indispensable to organizations of tomorrow. And he talks a little bit about art, about creating art, and about how there are a lot of people who, a lot of organizations aren't set up to incorporate people who are artists. Whether he means that necessarily in visual arts, fine arts, or just in people who are artistic thinkers and think of things differently. And his point is that we're kind of moving toward a world where we have organizations that are going to be looking for people who stand out and who are unique, as opposed to people who fit into cogs into the corporate machine. So I thought that was good, and that's me and how to find me, which is everywhere. And that's the end of slideshow. So I will click to exit. Thanks. So if you have any, I'm happy to. I'm here until I'm not. I know they want us out of the building at a certain point. But if anybody has any questions, I'm totally happy to answer them now. And again, you'll have the contact information in this presentation as well. So, anyone?
Kind of practical question.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm director of a UK-based charity which supports projects in Israel. And one of the challenges I've got is to get my Israeli counterparts to get on board with social media, and that understanding that news happens very quickly now, and that you can't, that basically the old-fashioned approach of a press release or this, whenever they want it, is not actually relevant anymore. Have you got any advice about how to bring other partners along with you if you're, especially in a different country, especially in Israel?
Right. So, there are certain kind of like old school media methods that you can use. So, for instance, you can go to where, for instance, there's a lot of eyeballs, for lack of a better term, on Times of Israel, for instance. So to have somebody who you work with write a piece for them, and especially if it's about something a little bit, either controversial or current, and that answers some of those questions that somebody might ask in an FAQ, like why is your organization that gives stuff to Israel better than the other organizations? What's the unique about it? If you can answer those questions and in a subtle way, you can do that. Also, you want to encourage, find your hubs, the people who can get that message out.
It's actually about getting the message from them. I don't know, do you find in your experience that Israel is kind of a bit behind?
Yeah, yes. I think Jewish nonprofit in general is behind, and it's upsetting, actually.
Digitally, they're behind as well. So,
yes.
I know somebody who's worked in digital media and has had to build a department himself in a media agency. When they do it really well. When they do social stuff, like there's some great examples of what Coca-Cola's done socially in Israel. But even they're so advanced in technology, but there are so many things that they're unfactored.
As a market researcher, I think it's probably a cultural thing. Because my question to you is, and I qualify as a firm believer in social media because I have a Twitter feed and Facebook,
Anyone can do it.
I worry that the 80-20 rule still applies, and that's something to struggle because an organisation that I am trying to engage with, for example, the United Synagogue, and just asked someone from the United Synagogue, it has 1,200 followers on Twitter, but it has 35,000 members, is it? Right, so there you go. So there's always that danger that, and even you're one with the New York-based organisation, I know some number of followers, 2,000. It's probably what? How many Jews in the US? 5 million? How many are unaffiliated or intermarried or whatever?
Right.
The challenge still remains. No, I know it's about equality, but I think the challenge of Jewish organisations remains communicating its message and reaching as wide an audience as possible, and engaging in conversations will be hugely important. But I think before you even get, because the problem is you're engaging, conversation exists, but amongst the most committed people at the moment, and the hurdles to overcome still remains is how do you get, if it's an Synagogue, for example, how do they get the other 30,000 people to be, okay, that's not realistic, but more and more people to be actively engaged and listening out for what they have to say, and then engaged in a conversation. I still think, even for brands, that hasn't been solved yet, despite the size of and the importance of social media.
I think part of it is making people aware that it's it's accessible to them. And I don't mean to say that, if a synagogue has, 4,000 members and 200 of them are on Twitter, which is probably a fair, distribution, at least in the States. First of all, those 200 can amplify a message, possibly better. But I think it's up to the organization in this particular case, like the rabbi and administrators, to bring the conversations that are happening on Twitter and Facebook into the other people. So like I've worked with a number of organizations that do a lot of specific work with synagogues and with Jewish nonprofits, and they all say that it's about making sure that the messages reach across all the channels. So sometimes the channel is one-to-one, sometimes the channel is a rabbi's sermon to a congregation, which is a very leadership style part one, stand-up comic, for lack of a better analogy, kind of approach. But the idea that he or she represents the conversation that's happening online and says, we'll be continuing this discussion actively in this space. And the space has to be not just Twitter and not just Facebook. There should be a blog. The rabbi could say, actually, after my sermon last week, so-and-so came up to me and pointed this out. And it reminded me of the connection of the conversation we had in Twitter. And so it's about being able to draw those connections. One of the things that I've heard a lot about, I used to be a journalist, so like the way that journalism works now is really in flux. And people haven't figured out how to make it work. And whenever I make a statement like that, I have to end up saying, especially in the Jewish world, because there's that level of micro where I talk to newspaper editors of their community newspapers, and they say, half of my audience is over 65, and they're not going to look at it on the internet. And I said, first of all, you might be over. People who are over in their 60s know how to use the internet. So first of all, you may not be correct. But secondly, I see your point is that there's a lot of, right, is that people know how to click on a website. And when I first started blogging, and I would tell my friends who were roughly my age, but they were not open to the idea of anything new technologically. So I would say to them, I have a blog, which you should just check out the blog. And they'd be like, I don't blog. And I said, you don't have to blog. I'm blogging, and you just have to read it. And they would say, but I don't know how it works. And I said, but it doesn't. Do you know how the internet works? Do you know how to go to a website? Because if you know how to go to a website, you know how to go to a blog. It's not this, I don't blog, I don't know how to blog. A part of it is the technology language is so overwhelming. And as soon as anybody says Twitter, they'll be like, oh, I don't know. What's a hashtag? I don't know what that is. And I can't even do anything. I can't, terrible at it, or whatever the story is. But so part of it is doing the outreach community, which, I can't reach out to every member of the community everywhere and say, I'll just sit down with you and spend an hour and we'll talk about Twitter and Facebook. But it's doing that to the extent that it's possible, and also to mobilizing the people who are already doing it, and then to create the bridges between the conversations that are happening in the digital space and the conversations that are happening in the real space, the real world, IRL, in real life space. So thank you guys for coming. I really appreciate it.